We're always learning. Everything we do, everyone we meet, all whom we come into contact impart something through themselves. In academia, cultural settings, life experience, and indeed religion. Some interactions are more significant to us than others. The genuine nature of a teacher is part of the message. The relevance of a message needs to be measured against the underlying purpose of the one communicating. There are many things about Jesus' ministry that will be remembered, but high on the list has to be his teaching, the way he taught, and both his method and his message centered on love. But how did Jesus teach people? And what was the source of his wisdom? Did he rely on education or the influence of being raised in a formal Jewish environment? Was it the influence of his mother and following Joseph perhaps in his workshop, or learning from the people who he lived alongside, both in Nazareth and in Capernaum? Billions of people have found the teaching of Jesus to be fascinating and endearing, but I'd like to put some of that teaching to the test. Here at the Mount of Beatitudes, Jesus delivered some of his most profound teaching. Jesus Christ is considered by many to be one of the best storytellers of all time, and some of his followers, centuries later, continue to share spiritual truths by telling his stories. Men and women in the realms of music, through literature, in politics, and in film and entertainment continue to share the message of God's love in real and tangible ways. Sharing the Christian faith and storytelling seem to go hand in hand. Any examination of the ministry of Jesus would be bound to conclude that parables, stories, mattered a great deal to him as a method of communicating. He was always wanting to communicate from experience, through experience, and to experience, using the everyday as a method and tool of telling the stories and the mission that he had come to bring. They're gathered in groups in the New Testament. If you turn to Matthew 13, we have parables, often known as the parables of the kingdom, because the kingdom of God was a recurring theme in his teaching. Now, people listened to what he had to say. There is no doubt whatsoever that the teaching methods of Jesus are an aspect of his ministry that he'll always stand out for. Remember, this is the day before books and newspapers. Stories were important. They were the way in which truth was communicated from one person to another. One can imagine in the life of the early church, people sitting down and being told what Jesus had said, and you can hear them say, can we hear that story about this? What about the one about the pearl, great price? What about this? They were so important and integral to his mission. And the stories often had, I won't call it a shock element, but it had an element at the end that left you either reeling or feeling, gosh, is that what truth is about? Sometimes they followed a pattern, a threefold pattern. There was this person, that person, and this person. For example, on the Good Samaritan story, where in fact somebody's passing down a road, one passes by, another passes by, and then another passes by. And that third person is the one that you're thrown back to listen about. I still think the parables of Jesus and the teaching methods of Jesus are worth closer examination, because I think they give us an insight into what he was talking about. When Jesus told parables, he used the raw material of people's lives. He used what happened to them at home. He used things that they handled. He used even what people cooked with and what they lived with every day. And from it drew truths that could be understood. And there's a timeless quality about them. People have been writing about the parables for so long because they found that they speak not only to one generation in which they were initially told, but to all generations who are open to a truth. You see, the kingdom of God was a new message. And for that message to be communicated, it required and needed a newness of approach. And Jesus amazed people when he spoke in parables and in stories. And the parables and stories Jesus told were not limited by setting, place, or time. He taught everywhere he went. His teachings were always appropriate to the situation and had universal appeal. This is the Via Maris, an old trade route that existed in the time of Jesus. At any one time, there would have been thousands of people making their way through here from Europe all the way to the Middle East. There would have been stalls and traders at regular intervals along the way, and Jesus would have walked this route when moving between Nazareth and Cana and the Sea of Galilee. It's a very, very significant thing that Jesus does when he walks with people, because it gives him the space and the time to talk to disciples and perhaps others on the way. He talks about trading. Trading is very much a part of what it was to go from town to town. He tells a story, a parable about looking always for that pearl that is the best pearl possible, and then landing upon it and being prepared to sell everything else for the sake of finding that one pearl. People in marketplaces would understand that. They'd also understand the business of people meeting in marketplaces and being collected for employment at different times of the day. And then Jesus shocked them all with the story that they'd all be paid the same, whether they came at the beginning or at the end. In that particular parable, the pearl of great price, Jesus is really saying, when you find God's kingdom, it's worth giving up everything else to gain it. Sharing parables or stories in the marketplace and along trade routes allowed Jesus to draw on examples that would enable him to reach more people with his message. Jesus didn't just use his words to teach his followers about the kingdom of God. He was always prepared to follow up with his actions or his deeds. Jesus also taught by doing. When he went down to the Jordan River to be baptized, he taught about the washing away of the old to be empowered for the new. When he healed the sick and the blind and called the children to himself after they'd been previously sent away by the disciples, he pointed to the value of all people, the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the sick and the healthy. His actions showed God's love for all.
So here I am at the Genesar Boat Museum. Why a boat museum, and why would we be here? Well, of course, it's at the Sea of Galilee, and in 1986, this amazing boat was recovered from the lake. But the real story is what lies behind this boat. For in a boat like this, so many of the stories of Jesus can be told. The call of Jesus was to disciples where they were asked to leave their boats, their nets, and the hired staff that they got. He came to them, you remember, skilled fishermen, to help them when they'd failed to catch fish. And then there was a storm at sea, and Jesus was asleep, we're told in Mark's Gospel, with his head on a pillow. And then there's that fantastic walking on the water, where Jesus comes to disciples, and he calls Peter out onto the water. But of course, Peter took his eyes off Jesus and sank. Right from the beginning of my Christian life, I've believed it's all about faith and action, word and deed, something that's real and makes all the difference. And when I stand by this boat, so many of these stories were exactly that.
Jesus was not one to let circumstances restrict him from showing God's love and compassion to people. In fact, he often used difficult moments to show the extent of God's love for all. Here at the Church of the Multiplication, pilgrims come from all around the world to remind themselves of how Jesus took loaves and fishes to feed a large crowd of people. There are, in point of fact, 2 instances that we know of where Jesus is reported to have fed large crowds of people. The multiplication of the loaves and fishes is one example of the word and deed ministry of Jesus, which took place in a remote location. The disciples are gathering together, and they're telling what they've achieved, the stories they've told, the things that they've seen, and they're sharing those stories as any group of friends would, but significantly as a group of friends who are following Jesus. The crowds were keeping them busy. They were coming and going, making requests, wanted to hear stories, and wanted to be very much part and near this new group of people that was making such an impression upon the area. Jesus knew that they really hadn't had some food. They'd been so busy. He said to them, let's go to a quiet place. Now, at the same time, the crowd that had been part of all that was happening with the disciples saw what they were doing. It's as if the news went from one to another saying, let's go and see where he's going. And we're told in the scriptures that they ran, and they outran the boat, so that when Jesus got off the boat, the truth was that they were there ready to greet him. Jesus got off the boat and looked at this crowd before him. He realized that these people were so eager to listen to what he got to say, so eager to hear this new teaching, that they would run in the heat to go and be beside him. It was a remote place, no shops nearby. It was getting late in the day, they'd nothing to eat, and so they go and they make a request of Jesus as to what they should do. And Jesus then says, you feed them. What a statement that was. You feed them? Well, that's the last thing that they could do. They had so little resources of themselves. And so they go off to look at what the resources were. And there are 2 things that we notice. Firstly, in John's Gospel, it tells us that they say a little lad. In fact, Andrew finds a little lad, a little boy, who's got to offer what he has. And what he offers is 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That's all he had, and that's what he was able to offer. Now, very clear instructions were given to the disciples to arrange everybody into groups, and the disciples served the food that Jesus blessed, reminding us of how he would bless meals so often in the story of the Christian faith. And the food was taken out, and it was impossible to imagine such a multiplication. From 5 loaves and 2 fishes, such a great crowd was fed. And here's the bottom line. When it was all over, there were 12 basketfuls left over. Now, you don't expect me to be able to easily explain that. All I know is this. It's interesting that it's recorded in all 4 Gospels, and that it becomes such an important part of the stories of Jesus. I think the overriding message is this, that Jesus Christ is able to take whatever it is we offer and do far more abundantly over and above anything we can imagine by the use of his power and his grace. By taking the bread and fish and feeding the large crowd, Jesus let his actions speak of God's love, provision, and compassion. Throughout his ministry, Jesus taught about forgiveness on so many occasions, and the reinstatement of Peter after he denied knowing Jesus 3 times in the lead up to the crucifixion is said to have taken place here at Tabgha. Today, this is a place of devotion, for contemplation and of celebration. But when the risen Lord is reported to have appeared to his disciples, and particularly to Peter, the tone was very different. The disciples had been fishing all night and hadn't caught any fish. Then Jesus called them in.
When they got to the shore, he had breakfast ready for them. Breakfast so that they could share together. And I suppose, like all people sharing a meal together, they were full of conversation. No doubt on this occasion dominated by the story of Jesus. But as they shared together in that meal, Jesus kind of called, I can imagine him saying, Peter, I need to have a word with you, and takes him to one side. So nobody else could overhear these words, and these words probably entered our scriptures through the experience and words of Peter himself. And there is an interrogation of love. He needs reinstating. Why? Well, because what happened in the courtyard of his denial of Jesus, even though his accent is recognized as that of Galilean, even though there is the sense in which people maybe identified him, he wanted nothing to do with it, and so he needed to express a denial himself. Well, here on the beachside, there is the reinstatement. The reinstatement that is going to be so important. 3 times, like 3 denials, he's asked if he actually loves Jesus. And that's an important thing for Peter to experience. It's painful, I suspect. Love is the focus, as it is all throughout the teaching of Jesus. And the reason why the reinstatement is so important in terms of forgiveness is this is going to be the heart of the message that Peter, as the first leader of the church, is going to share across the whole of the known world with Paul and all the apostles that will follow. The love of God through forgiveness.
So on this beachside, in that Easter experience, Jesus teaches a model of forgiveness that not only restores that which is broken, but also reinstates the individual. In the days of Jesus' ministry, there were others claiming to be Messiah, built on the premise that sometime God would send a Saviour to deliver his people from their enemies. But Jesus taught a message of forgiveness and acceptance, and a response of complete devotion to God. Not only did he teach his followers by telling stories and through his actions, he also taught by sharing God's love and compassion. He gave his time. He gave people his attention, and he shared out of the depths of his heart.
Now, I'm walking past reeds here. It's not far from the lake itself to where people live. And that's how it was in the days of Jesus. And he was making his way, and he was greeted by people. I don't know how many, but it seems to indicate in the New Testament there were plenty of them. But one person stood out remarkably from the crowd. This was a man called Jairus. Now, we're told that he had a particular position in the synagogue, so he was a person of standing. But when Jesus met him, he was a broken man. Why was he broken? Well, I suspect for reasons we'd well understand. His daughter was seriously ill. We know from what we follow in the later passage, she is near to death, and he needs help. And he'd heard about Jesus, the Galilean who brought healing into people's lives. So he comes and he asks for Jesus to respond to him and bring help. And what does Jesus do? Well, what he always does, responds to need superbly, immediately, and responsibly. And Jesus responds powerfully to Jairus and sets off on a journey.
In this church at Magdala, we're reminded of a woman who encountered Jesus.
Jesus is on a mission to bring healing to this synagogue leader's little daughter. However, the crowd press on him, and there he is in the middle of them. Perhaps they're waiting for him to teach, tell a story. But as he is there, somebody snuck up behind him and just touched the hem of his garment. And as they touched the hem of his garment, it was as if Jesus felt power go from him. He turned to say, "Who touched me?" And the person who touched him was a woman who for 12 years has been ill with a hemorrhage of blood. A person who has been in a situation where she would easily be rejected by other people had she made that illness known to everyone. So she thought, if I'm going to be near to Jesus, I'm going to quietly touch him. But Jesus wanted to bring healing to this woman, and that's exactly what he did. And the healing was of body, yes, but it would be of standing and significance and worth in the community. But Jesus is on a mission, and it's as he's on that mission that news reached him.
This little girl of just 12 years, the daughter of Jairus, had apparently died. Jesus continues on his journey and goes into their home with Peter, James and John.
Just imagine, let's try and picture this as a kind of bedroom that the little girl was in. So you can imagine when you've got mum and dad, the little girl, Jesus, Peter, James and John, you've got a very crowded scene. And what does he do? he does something very natural. He takes the little girl's hand and holds the hand and says, Talitha cum, which simply means, little girl, get up. And as he gets hold of the girl's hand, what does she do? But she wakes up. She gets up. She walks around. I should imagine they moved out of the way while the little girl walked around. There was a real sense of something very powerful and special happening. And so what does he do? He tells her, get some food for her. She needs some food. And I don't know that this was the kitchen area, but I suspect it was a small area. Some people went off and got the food for one of these rulers of the synagogue's little girl, who was now alive. What a day this was. Somebody who'd been ill for 12 years is given healing. And somebody who for 12 years had all the energy of a child who had died is now raised to new life.
Jesus had been asked to go to the home of Jairus to see his sick daughter. Why did Jesus stop in the busy crowd to give his complete attention to the sick woman? And why did Jesus continue to the home of the dead girl and raise her to life? Was it simply because he could? Or was there something about God's loving nature that Jesus was teaching his followers? Throughout his ministry, Jesus was well aware of how he was perceived, not only by his adversaries, the crowds and his followers, but also by his disciples. When Jesus was here in Caesarea Philippi, about a day's walk north of the Sea of Galilee, he shared perhaps one of the most confronting truths about himself with Peter, James, and John.
Now, the location is significant. If you look carefully here, you'll see that there are many symbols and signs. The town is named after a Roman emperor and a client king. You see the cave of Pan, which is thought to be a cave of the underworld. And you see lots of rocks around here, which will make sense of some of the words that Jesus directly addressed Peter with. Jesus is wanting to ask questions of these disciples. He says, who do you say that I am? That's to the three of them. Who do you say that I am? And we're told there were three distinct answers. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, and one of the prophets. But Jesus didn't want that answer alone. He then addressed them and said, but who do you say that I am? Now, here's an interesting thing. He addresses the question to the disciples, but it's Peter. Peter, maybe, who isn't just the impetuous, but the one who's always eager to answer for all of them. He says, oh, you're more than that. And he gives that real picture of him being Messiah. And when he says that he's Messiah, Jesus responds to him and said, you know, that didn't come from your own mind. That wasn't something you learnt somewhere. God the Father has revealed that to you. And at that moment, Jesus, looking at Peter, says, you are Simon, but you'll be Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. You can see how it all makes sense in this setting. One further thing that's important for us to grasp, it's something that's true throughout the New Testament gospel account, and that is that Jesus often says to the disciples, don't say anything about it. It's what we call the messianic secret. That's something that will only be able to be told, only be able to be revealed after Jesus has been glorified. Until then, look, just keep it to yourselves. And I think that's what he was saying to Peter, and that's what he was saying to his disciples. Even though he took the three of them away from the rest, it's as if he's saying, when you get back, don't let that be the topic of all that you hear and say. Let it be you've had a wonderful time, yes, but don't go into what you're learning from me. Jesus is prepared to teach these three very significant leaders about himself, revealing of himself.
By asking the disciples questions about himself in this particular setting, Jesus showed he would address the heart of an issue, correct any misunderstanding that might have existed among the disciples, and equip them for what was to come. What does it take for people to learn a spiritual truth? For some, it comes through formal academic training. For others, through life's experience. And for others still, it takes a miracle from God. Jesus showed that he was prepared to do whatever it took to reach people and to share God's love. He taught by telling stories, leading by example, by sharing his emotions and himself, and by identifying and addressing the heart of an issue before him and his followers. This was a significant change to the custom of the day, as Jesus, through his words and actions, contradicted the expectations of those who anticipated something very different from the prophecies to be fulfilled. Jesus talked about the love of God and how it had to be shared with others, and that was altogether more important than any tradition and any custom.
But it wasn't just what he taught, it was how he taught.